you ready to test your answers? Maybe let's start with those easy ones. Which one was easy? Who figured it like within 10 minutes?
This one doesn't change.
Ah, okay. Let's try this one. I'll try to make sure.
Each one has two neighbors.
So this one is called beehive. And so you initialize the planet now. I have the link in the top. You say go, and you see time goes by and it changes. So it's an example of a still life. That's what they call it. Does anybody else have still life?
That was ours?
There was yours as well. There's no mine as well. Did anybody have like 2x2 block?
Yeah, mine.
Okay. So, well, I apologize for that. This wasn't interesting, but I wanted to demonstrate that it can happen. So again, time goes by, nothing happens. So, what was more interesting? Anything blinking, oscillating, something? Okay. Did you have like the 15 squares? I'm sorry, the 10 black squares, the long line?
Yeah, the 10 square line.
Actually, somebody must also have 3 only.
In the back.
What do you think happens there?
It's just oscillate.
Oscillate. Okay, so this is, let's see, you're right. Oscillates. It's an oscillator. It's a 2-period oscillator. I think somebody else has another 2-period oscillator. Just not quite as obvious. Do you have 3 and 3? Okay. So let's check this one. Like this? Is it like this? Oscillates differently. Also with period 2, and you can adjust the speed if it's too fast. For you. All right. Let's try that 10. You may think, okay, maybe if I just put a few in a row, it always oscillates. Well, not necessarily. It may not always be with the same period. So let's count 10 of them. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. By the way, you can drop most of those from a menu, but I don't. It's a very long list, and it's not alphabetical. So actually, this is a 15-period oscillator. It's really hard to tell just by looking at it what's going to happen. Let's see. Anybody with another oscillator? So yours is. Can you show it to me again? I think it's I think I know what it is. It's a 3-period oscillator. Yeah. And actually, I don't see it on my screen. I have to look here to enter it, but hopefully I can do that. And then add this. Okay.
Oh yeah, we did all
Yeah, eventually, sometimes has to overcome the initial conditions. And you can freeze it if you want. All right. I guess. Oh no, there any gliders? I think there is one. I'll end with this.
You got all those right.
Thank you. But I think somebody else has to have a glider.
Yeah, we do like over and over again.
Did anybody have something like this? And by glider means it just travels across the plane and goes away. So it's infinite.
Ours doesn't.
Did anybody have something like this? Am I drawing it correctly?
That's sort of ours.
I was upside down.
Oh, this is the main
Okay.
That's ours.
That's ours too.
Looking which direction it's going to go. I should put them all in the center. So it's still going, it's just out of our plane. Okay, now the master
So
line.
you put that one on a torus, it would be periodic.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, actually, I think one of the modifications is doing cellular automata in the ports. You can do all kinds of modifications. Yeah. So let's do the last glider. So give me a second. I'll put it in the center because I don't remember which way it lies. And it has 3 here, I think. 3, 1, and then I think 2 here.
That's right.
Like that. So it kind of produces things, absorbs them, spreads around, comes back together. Do you remember these guys, the little blocks, the steel lights? So
Yeah, I figured all that
actually, it sells to this one. So this is called the queen bishop. And oh, by the way, the 10 cells next to each other are called the pentadecathlon. And the 3-period oscillator is a pulsar. So they all have all kinds of nerdy names. All right. So I can go back to my presentation. Oh, that's another slide. I didn't have time for it. Okay, well this is the URL where I took it from. There is a Java flag that you can play the game and waste a lot of time. It's fun. And actually I didn't show you, don't want to go back because it crashed my computer before. But there are actually lots of initialization, because you see it's tedious to click yourself, so there are lots of complex initializations that you may want to try, then let go and see what happens, and like this one, and some of them are pretty cool. And for example, when you have a bunch of blocks, what do you do to get rid of them? So the gliders help with blocks and all that. Especially, oftentimes the goal is to keep it within the screen and have it going on for a long time. So some surprising, or maybe not so surprising facts about Game of Life. So it's not really a game. You may have realized that there are no players, no winning or losing. It's just you start with initialization and you observe what happens. Really the game is to try to predict what happens and to see something interesting. So in most cases, as you convinced yourselves, hopefully, it is pretty much impossible to look at the starting position and determine what happens in the long run. In simple cases, sure, but it's hard in general. And I said this, and I really don't believe in it, that it was the rise and the fall of Cellular Automata, that maybe better things would have happened without the Game of Life, but just because it's fun, as Jim said, doesn't mean it's useless. As we all know, computer games and all kinds of other recreational activities gave rise to some really important research. So why is it interesting, other than fun? So it's one of the simplest examples which you can show it to a 5-year-old that very elaborate patterns can emerge from simple rules. So it's one of the so-called self-organizing systems. And you can really generate very complicated configurations. And Conway himself, John Conway, the creator of life, he didn't have always the best intuition. I mean, it's normal to not be able to predict everything that happens. So, for example, at first he believed that no pattern could produce an infinite number of cells. And he even put out an award for a counterexample, and almost immediately people came back with many counterexamples. You see the first one is one of those little gliders. It's, yeah, this one is probably the simplest. And they just keep gliding. I'm restarting the animations. They'll go away too quickly. Okay. And I like those. There are 2 configurations that we know of. I don't know if there is a proof that there are others, but we know of 2 configurations that can be reached from any other. So they're called Gardens of Eden. So unless you start from here, you can't get back here. How complex is life really? And here it gets a bit hypothetical and theoretical, because you can claim that a computer lives inside life. Because you can say, okay, you can construct it in such a way that gliders and spaceships are types of gliders, more complicated gliders, can be used to send information like electrical signals and like signals in a physical computer. And again, those strings of gliders can perform all the logical functions that the computer has to perform. So in theory, yes, you can build a computer using life. It would be extremely impractical to do that. And there have been attempts to do that. Actually, a computer has been built, and it just, even life has to be large enough and it takes time. But actually, one of the interesting special purpose computer was one that outputs prime numbers. Number 2. Impressed? Okay. All right. So what is it good for? And again, there are different opinions on that. And oh, I don't know why it's cutting it down there, but some are really out there. Others are very concrete, practical applications because you can study patterns and discover other phenomena in math and science. And to me, what personally to me is the most interesting is the biological aspect of it, because what we think is intelligent behavior, for example, ants creating a home, we perceive, oh, maybe there is some level of intelligence we don't quite understand. Well, it's very possible that this is all based on very simple rules, that it puts into question what's intelligence. So it becomes a philosophical. What do we call intelligence? Maybe we ourselves function the same way, it's just very simple rules, we're not really intelligent, who knows? So I like to speculate about it. And actually traffic problems could be solved using cellular automata. Again, when you drive your car, you don't know what happens 2 streets down, but you see the neighboring cars and you react to the cars around you, especially, well, just the ones you see really. And also, computer bias can be considered an example of a cellular automata, and accordingly finding cures for a computer virus can be done, at least theoretically, using cellular automata. I don't know if it's been done. Human diseases could possibly be tackled using cellular automata and modeling when a cell is alive or dies. I know people have thought about cancer cells, inhibiting reproduction of cancer cells, which is how you ultimately cure cancer if you can. Just stop the really fast rate of reproduction of cancerous cells. And this one I like because it's very hypothetical, hasn't been done, but we can send on Mars a robot that can build other robots, because it's not cheap or easy to send anything to Mars or anything out in space, but if you can send something that can create other stuff given the resources available on Mars, and there are claims that there is enough there, then you can do who knows what on Mars, and it will be great. But it hasn't been done yet. Okay? And this is an application I know very little about. I just found it preparing for this talk that in the 70s, geographers used cellular automata for something they called urban cellular automata, and it became pretty mature until the 80s. Into the 80s, it was forgotten for quite a while, and now it's emerging again. And there was actually a recent article I noticed that in geography people use that. I don't know much about it. Just Google it, geography, urban cellular automata, you'll find it. And some variations, finally, on cellular automata. Use your imagination. You can do any variation you want. We really only explored one set of rules, the Conway's game of life. Well, there are other sets of rules you can think about, and also you can change the grid, hexagonal, triangular, irregular grids even. It's probably more practical if you talk about cells in the living organisms to think about irregular grids. And more complicated neighborhoods, instead of just 4 or 8 cells surrounding the cell, maybe something extended, something bigger than that. And I find this really interesting that generally they don't introduce too much of a significant effect when it comes to patterns. Depending on the particular application, maybe there are other reasons you want to do this, but if you just want to observe patterns, strangely enough, not too much changes. Another surprising fact for me is that whether you do synchronous or asynchronous update, whether you update everybody at the same time or some at one time, others at other times, not too much changes. Parallel or sequential, actually I misspoke. As asynchronously updated Cellular Automata produce simpler results. The patterns are somewhat similar, but at the end, you don't get as complicated patterns as you would with sequential update, which I find counterintuitive. Okay? And actually, you can combine Cellular Automata with differential equations, and so your update rules can be really complicated, as complicated as well. And if you're interested in reading more, I'm sure I used other sources. I just don't remember everything I used. But if somebody asks me what should I look up, I would say maybe start with those sources. And once again, this is the Java plane that I was showing you. But all these are classic books. You see, they date back to the 80s, when probably the most active research took place. And that's it.
Any questions? Well, I've got one actually. This occurred to me while you were giving your talk. You know how, like, in Conway's life, a dead cell becomes alive and it's surrounded by two live cells. Has anybody ever looked at how just changing one of those rules just slightly would make a difference?
Oh yeah, there are variations on Game of Life. I showed you the set of rules that applies to this particular plat. There are all kinds of variations on it. I don't think anything changes dramatically in the sense that, oh, we don't have periodic behavior anymore, or something like that. Changing the rules, tweaking the rules slightly doesn't change too much, and that's why there's so many of them.
Wow.
To make it just harder to predict what's going on. Of course, if you change them a lot dramatically, like you require only, I'm just throwing it out, for a cell to become alive, maybe you require all 8 cells to be alive, something like that. That's probably going to change quite a bit.
Right.
But small tweaking, no.
And I have a comment of my own to add. There's a site, I think it's the one you use, Wonders of Life.
Yeah.
Right, where if you go there, it's got a bunch of those Conway, patterns. One of them's called the space filler that I think fills up as much as possible because everything stays on once it comes on. And it looks just like Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob. That thing grows up really fast and it's very symmetric. So if you want to have some fun, blow up the screen and make it grow for a while and then stop it and turn one of the little things off and then run it again and watch what happens, right? It's kind of, you'll ask me for those 2 hours back on Monday. Any other questions? Yes.
A comment, actually. You had the people in here doing exactly what Conway and Guy were doing, except they did it on the floor in the math lounge at Cambridge when they were examining this in 1970. And this is an indication of how much more we can understand now with computer systems, where we can run the game of life at 1 billion time clicks a second and see what happens in the really long term, where Conway couldn't develop any intuition for how this was going to behave when the patterns got large and complicated because it took an hour to do an update.
Right, well, and his guess was that there was no pattern that would create implemented cells, right?
This was before he discovered the embedding of Turing machines.
I thought about the walls here, like, janitors would appreciate that.
Other questions? All right, let's thank our speakers.